Today, stock markets around the world continued in a downward spiral as the ripple effect of Donald Trump's sweeping tariff announcements
threatens China with more tariffs.
Dow was on a roller coaster ride yesterday and
triggers fears of a global recession.
Perekonomian kita asasnya adalah kekeluargaan. Tidak boleh ada orang yang lapar di republik yang merdeka 80 tahun. Tidak boleh ada orang yang tinggal di bawah kolong jembatan. Ini menusuk rasa keadilan. Ini yang mendasari dan kita buat strategi.
The United States has been in a commercial war with many countries in the world, and we wanted to understand how that could impact Indonesia. And that led to the project that I'm going to show you right now, in which we engage in a simulation exercise to try to understand that impact. So, as you know, the United States government has announced an intent to impose tariffs on imports coming from many trade partners. One of them that is key in East Asia is China. But these tariffs on countries like China could represent opportunities for countries like Indonesia that could jump into the products or the industries that are affected by these tariffs. So what we decided to do is to do a project in which we started by gathering global trade data from the OECD.World, from the WTO, and then we used that data to build an econometric model to estimate the direct and indirect impact of tariffs. And we then used this model to estimate how an increase in tariffs, for instance, in China, would open opportunities for Indonesia, but also wanted to compare Indonesia to other countries because those opportunities were also, for instance, open to Vietnam or Thailand or Mexico, and wanted to see how Indonesia compared.
Dengan adanya kenaikan tarif di Amerika Serikat memunculkan sebuah pemikiran trade diversion ini yang sekarang sedang dibahas di dunia. Negara mana yang bisa menjadi...
The basic question that we're going to try to explore is how a percentage increase in US tariffs on China would impact Indonesia's export potential. We're going to do this on 3 steps. The first step is the most technical one, is that we estimated a model that estimates the potential exports of a country 4 years into the future. And this model includes a number of factors like the GDP, the distance, concepts of economic complexity like the ones that you saw in the previous video, whether countries have previous colonial relationships, borders, and so forth. So the first thing is the direct impact. If the US were to impose a 10 percentage point increase in tariffs to China, China's exports would be reduced by 42 to 43 billion. And there would be countries that would win. For instance, Mexico's export to the United States would increase. Canada's exports to the United States would increase by about 3.7 billion. Japan, South Korea, Vietnam would also increase. But Indonesia would also, as we're going to see, increase as well. It would increase in about 1.7 billion in this particular scenario. So, for example, light fixtures, we would expect an impact of about 1.9 billion reduction in exports from the United States to China. Rubber footwear is also another sector that would be impacted heavily. Broadcasting equipment, would be another sector that would suffer a grave impact as well. Here we have the sectors that will be impacted the most. So basically these are the sectors in which China would, let's say, lose competitiveness relative to what they have right now and would open opportunity to other countries. Mexico would be the one that would win the most. Vietnam would also win a lot. But Indonesia is up there. It's one of the countries that would benefit the most from the US imposing tariffs on China. It would experience an increase in exports that we would expect to be about 1.7 billion. As a percentage of its current exports, it would be one of the countries that would win the most because Mexico and Vietnam export much more to the United States right now. So Indonesia's gain would be about 6% of its current exports to the US. It's huge, What can we do in this case? What would be some strategic decisions that we can take? The first one is that I think it would be important to differentiate Indonesia's online presence from competitors. So today we live in a world in which people do the first time that they hear about something or someone is they go online, they search for it. Search engine like Google or even today using an AI. And in the past, one thing that we've seen work very well is building, this economic data visualization and distribution platforms that can be used to empower a country's foreign direct investment efforts by providing them with highly polished solutions that they can use to show their country's economy. This is something that we did in Mexico. We started a project in Mexico in 2019, and when the pandemic came in 2020 and the world moved online, Mexico trained all of its embassies to use, this platform called Data Mexico that you can visit yourself to basically show, Mexico's capabilities and help attract foreign direct investment. And it was a very effective way to engage with people outside of Mexico, and Mexico is a country that lives a lot from attracting that foreign direct investment because that integrated to the United States through the US and North America, and Canada trade agreement. Today, this is not an option, it's not a nice to have thing, it's a must have, and many countries are kind of like jumping into the production of this type of technologies. The second one is to use business intelligence to identify potential buyers. So today we have more fine-grained data, and if there are potential buyers in certain sectors, we can try to identify them using this type of data and business analytic tools. So here, let's focus on three things. Textile footwear, it's one product in which Indonesia has the opportunity to win. It's a product in which Indonesia is very competitive, and it's a product that in the case that the US were to impose tariffs on China, Indonesia is expected to receive a huge boost in demand and therefore in exports. Another product is where Indonesia might want to go, broadcasting equipment. So you want to move maybe from garments to electronics, and this is a product in which you might want to go to, but we know that you would face tougher competition from Thailand, from Malaysia, from Vietnam, from Mexico, because more countries that you are competing with directly are involved in broadcasting equipment, and there's a little bit of catch-up that needs to be done there. And that one is rare earth metals, which is a product that exists in Indonesia, but is not exported in great amounts right now. And what we can do is we can use this bill of lading data to identify those potential buyers. So for instance, when we look at Indonesian exporters to the US, here on the left, these are companies in Indonesia that export textile footwear to the United States, and on the right you have distributors in the United States that are importing these goods. So these Mia Shoes or Hey Dude Incorporated or Top Glory Trade Group are big distributors that would buy these products in the United States, and then they're the ones that would be stocking these other stores. So we can identify who we would need to target in Indonesia to help stimulate the economy on that side, but also in the United States to see if we can make those deals. Here in broadcasting equipment, Indonesia has, let's say, fewer exporters to the US that are engaged in large volume of exports. But here on the right side, you would see which companies in the US are the distributors that are purchasing those products from China right now and could switch to Indonesia as a supplier. And the same here for rare earth metals. There are some exporters in Indonesia, and here there are importers in the United States that are importing rare metals from China, and we can identify those and we could target those. Don't buy from China, buy from us, buy from Indonesia. But it's important to remember that the US is big, but it's not all of the world. And Indonesia has an interesting pattern of comparative advantage right now, in which it's an economy that has been moving more and more into manufacturing, in garments and in electronics, and could be complementary to other parts of the world. So for instance, Indonesia would be very complementary to the economies of Africa and Latin America. There are parts of Africa that are growing relatively fast, and Indonesia is much more competitive than those places in the manufacturing of electronics and garments. So it would have a good comparative advantage to engage in that space. Indonesia doesn't have trade agreements with many countries in Latin America, for instance, and Asia. So there are opportunities there outside of the United States. The United Kingdom might also be an opportunity in that after they left the EU, they are desperate to make trade agreements and deals. And I think Indonesia has a lot to offer potentially to the UK in the exports of electronics and garments and other forms of manufacture as well. And in Africa, which is a continent that people sometimes don't look that much into, there are also a lot of opportunities. There are countries that have been industrializing. For instance, Morocco is a country that has become a big and important exporter of cars, and cars would consume electronics, but Morocco doesn't have that competitive advantage in electronics. So that could be another place in which Indonesia's exports could grow. So it's important to think outside the US. The next recommendations are related to this, but they go into arguments that we can use to counteract how the US is framing the narrative on trade. Because one of the reasons why the US is looking to impose tariffs on other countries is because they run a trade deficit with those countries. And the United States runs a trade deficit with Indonesia, but that trade deficit does not include digital products. For example, Indonesia imports a lot of digital products from the US. When someone in Indonesia opens their computer and watches a movie on Netflix, that's digital trade. When someone in Indonesia pays for a dating app that is produced elsewhere, that's digital trade. And when you take that digital trade into account, the trade deficit is not as large in favor of Indonesia as using only physical products. It cuts it more or less by half, which is enormous. So in the conversation with the United States, if the argument that the US brings is like, well, we're running a huge trade deficit, with Indonesia, you can say, well, but actually that trade deficit, it's overestimated because when you consider digital products, it's about half what you expect. And the last part would be to help strengthen the global presence of the Made in Indonesia brand. I think as someone that travels around the world, regularly, people are not very familiar with the manufacturing manufacturing capacities of Indonesia. But when you look at the details, Indonesia is associated with a lot of brands that are associated with high quality and that are strong brands, for instance, in the manufacturing sector, like Indonesia manufactures for Nike, Adidas, H&M, Zara. You could create campaigns in which you strengthen the Made of Indonesia brand, and you basically start associating yourself with those brands that are made in the country, because that is something that could help bring the quality of the Indonesia brand into like a global stage, which I think it deserves, but it has yet to achieve. What we did here was to create a model to estimate Indonesia's possible gains. And this is a very flexible model. You can use it to look at different scenarios where the US were to impose tariffs on Mexico, then what would be the impact of Indonesia? You can change the tariff rate and so forth. We presented one example just to show you how the mechanics work, but I think now you would be empowered to do, other examples. And we found that in the event that the US were to impose tariffs on China, there would be great opportunities for Indonesia in footwear, textile, but also in other sectors such as trunk and cases, plywood, and there would be some opportunities in electronics, but in this case, the competition would be much tougher. So to strengthen Indonesia's position, we recommend to improve its online presence, to differentiate it from competitors. You can have a data Indonesia when Vietnam maybe doesn't have a data Vietnam. You can use business intelligence to help identify potential buyers. When we identify those, we can go after those buyers in the US, which are looking probably to hedge. They're looking for other suppliers because they're afraid of what their government might do when it comes to tariffs, and they don't want to be left out in the cold without a potential supplier in a country that is not China. And we also would recommend thinking about how to strengthen the presence of the Made in Indonesia brand, and part of that strategy would be to connect it with other well-known brands that are already made in Indonesia and people might not be aware of. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. A round of applause for Professor César Hidalgo. And